So tonight as we get started, I wanted to read a few verses of Scripture, and it's from Isaiah chapter 41. This is right after 28 through 31 of chapter 40 is the verse or the verses about those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They'll mount up with wings as eagles. And then God responds, and we don't often read this part. God responds and he says, "Be silent before me, you islands. Let the nations renew their strength. Let them come forward and speak. Let us meet together in the place of judgment. Who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? He hands nations over to him and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword, to wind-blown chaff with his bow. Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them and with the last, I am he." So I read that to remind us that God always has a plan. God always is awake. God always works. And now we're able to go through history and see how he has worked through people like us. Some of them have been royal born, some of them have been pauper born, and everything in between. But God is the architect. And so tonight we're continuing our 12 disciples of the English Bible. Last week, as you know, we went through the Venerable Bede, and tonight we're going to discuss Alfred the Great. And many people have not heard of Alfred the Great, especially if you're not from the British Isles, but he was something. Before we get to him, though, let's back up a little bit, fill in a little bit more background, because it'll become important in a few minutes. In review, last week we had this slide, and it said the Eternac Gospels were probably taken by Willibrord, a Northumbrian missionary, to his newly founded Abbey of Echternach, now in Luxembourg, from which they are named. And so this was a page of the Gospel of John, the facing page. And he mentions Willibrord. And Willibrord was the grandfather of Alcuin. Now there's another name I've thrown at you, but we're about to explain it. It's important, though, because you can see families where the grandfather has been an influence makes a difference that is long-lasting for generations and generations. So he started an abbey, went as a missionary from England, Middle England, to Luxembourg, and as he was there and had a family, and then his son had a family in France, northern France area, Alcuin, who was a British theologian to the court of Charlemagne. And of course, as you know, Charlemagne was the most important and powerful king in Europe at the time. AD 735 to 804, these little red circles are circles around representations, though we don't have an actual portrait of him, it was so early, of Alcuin, who was a great theologian during that time and had studied. He knew, we often in our erudition think about people back in that time as being not very well educated, kind of Neanderthalish, walking around and living under thatched roofs of huts. This guy spoke Hebrew, Greek, wrote them both, and wrote in Latin and spoke Latin as well as English and German. Now, do you speak 5 languages? So, he was the British theologian to the court of Charlemagne. So, to give you a picture of what's happening politically back in those days, you had the Carolingian court, which is the court of Charlemagne, and came down from his fathers through Pepin, etc., that secured Europe from the Muslims down here. But that's another story I won't get into. But right here, there is this area that was a land where the Pope and the Papal States in Rome had all of this area of the boot of Italy, and then Charlemagne had all of this area of Europe. And there's a stained glass window that this picture is taken from of Charlemagne with the rod of the ruler and the crown holding the church. And they were having a big row back in those days because the Pope wanted to be the head of everything and said, God gave me permission and the mission to be the head of everything, the head of all the kings, the head of all religion, the head of everything. And Charlemagne said, well, I want to know where that came from. So I want to look at the original documents. And he did. And he found, because a British theologian named Alcuin helped him to realize that the Pope had no real claim, biblically and historically. And so he didn't pay the Pope to be the Pope and to be the head of everything. So we had this struggle going on between the Franks and the Pope and all of his people that were trying to coalesce around his power, and the Pope was having trouble with the Muslims down here that were marauding and basically owned the Mediterranean back in those days, and they were trying to make the whole world an Islamic world. And so you can see the Pope is caught between Charlemagne and the Muslim caliphates, and he desperately wanted more and more power and needed more and more power because he was in danger of being taken over by one or the other, especially the Muslims who were raiding all along here. And so the Pope was pushing this way because he knew he couldn't push this way. Does that make sense? And so that's why the popes became so militant. And that's the situation that Alcuin and the court of Charlemagne found themselves in. But Alcuin revised the Latin Vulgate by order of Charlemagne, using Old Latin and Greek manuscripts brought from the Holy Land. He was commissioned by Charlemagne to do this. And Charlemagne preserved this good Latin text. He called it, I have my good Latin text, instead of the Pope's Vulgate text. Until at his death, the Pope forbade its circulation. Now, why would the Pope forbid the circulation of a good Latin text of the Bible from the original documents? Because the popes up until that time had spent a couple of 100 years striking out and revising and adding to make sure they could have their power base. And the Pope didn't like it, but he couldn't do anything about it while Charlemagne was in power. But when Charlemagne died, the Pope said, you can't have that anywhere in Europe. You can't have that good Latin text. Only the Vulgate that we've revised at the power base for the last few hundred years. Here's one example. I'd love to give you many and have more talk about this, but we just don't have time. In the Vetus Latina, which is the Old Latin text, not the Vulgate, but the Old Latin text, it says in Luke, where Jesus says, the disciples say, teach us to pray. And Jesus says, here's how you're going to pray. It says, give us this day our daily bread. Well, in the old text, in the Old Latin and in the Greek, it says, quotidianum panem, which means daily bread. And yet, the Vulgate Revised said, give us this day our daily bread, supersubstantialem panem. What that means is supersubstantial bread. It means when you take the communion, the body and the blood of Christ are really the body and blood of Christ. That when a Catholic priest prays over it, it magically becomes actually the body and the blood of Christ. And when you take it, you're ingesting Christ into you, making you saved. Well, so they had an entire system around this. If you didn't take that every week at Mass, Jesus kind of wore off, went through your system, and you had to take it again at Mass every time you came, and it was illegal to take it without an official Catholic priest giving it to you. And so you see the system? You're going to go to hell if you don't take communion every week and bring a little something for the priest and for the Pope in order to stay saved. And so this was why they hated this old Latin or good Latin text, because at so many points during it, you go back to the original and it's like, how did that get in here? We know how it got in here, right? Okay, so now we're going to get to Alfred the Great. How about that? Yay! Alfred the Great. Meanwhile, back in Britain, Alfred the Great comes along. Now, look what he looks like. He's got his sword. You know, lots of emperors and kings, when they had their statues made, or when the people had statues made of them, they've got their sword out. You know, like, I'm conquering, I'm going forth to win in battle. This is the way he always lifted his sword for the people. And it's in the shape of a cross. And he was a devout Christian. And this is from a stained glass window in Britain. And it's got him holding the Bible, and it's got him holding the orb of rulership along with his staff and his crown. And the crown has the cross on the top of it. He is the representative and the ruler of the people under God. So, Alfred the Great, 849 to 899 AD. Alfred means elf council. And back in those days, that was a big thing. They considered, back in days before any kind of writing, that the elves were a people that were not little people or weird people or people with pointy ears, but they were the people who would get together in a council of the tribes and make the rulings for people. So he was elf council. He was king of Wessex from 871 to 899. Alfred successfully defended his kingdom against the Viking attempt at conquest, and by the time of his death had become the dominant ruler in England. He's the only English monarch to be accorded the epithet the Great. Details of Alfred's life are described in a work by the 10th century Welsh scholar and bishop Asser. So that's 10th century. That's only a few years after he died. So we've got this continuing, really close documentation of the time that he lived. So, what was he so famous for? He defeated the Vikings in the Battle of Edington in AD 878. So there had been long this battle between the Vikings coming across from the Danish areas and taking over the Isles of England. And they had to build all of these red dots, or forts, that he built all around England to have people closely when someone would see the Danish ships coming, the Viking ships coming to take over and loot and pillage and all of that, they would be able to marshal forces. They never had that before. And so the Vikings could get on shore and establish themselves and then begin to pillage the area. But Alfred pushed them out and over so that only this little part of England was the Viking Danelaw, the Viking area of control. They still couldn't push them all the way off of the island, but he made a treaty with them and said, you will not come off this little particular area of England. And they didn't for his lifetime. Now, this is another stained glass of Alfred's father. So how did Alfred get so dedicated and become such a great king to do all of this? Well, his father's name was Ethelwulf. And Ethelwulf was from Boethicius' writing in 500s AD. He says that Ethelwulf quoted, "Therefore from vice ensue virtue. Raise your soul to upright hopes. Send up on high your prayers for this earth. If you would be honest, great is the necessity enjoined upon your goodness, since all you do is done before the eyes of an all-seeing judge." So, Christian, back in the 500s on up, and we talked about before the 500s last week and the week before, right? And so, you'll notice that, what is this that Ethelwulf has that he's holding up? He's sitting on a church. And so he's sitting representing the king who is protecting the people and their church. And he's got this, well, it's eggs. Eggs represented new birth, because a chick would hatch out of them. And it represented the 12 apostles in their writings. And it's interesting, this is where we got, because of this is where we got a dozen eggs in every carton that we get. Why wouldn't it be 10? You know, what we're human beings. We have 10 fingers and 10 toes, and we have tens. We do things in tens. Well, they started bringing eggs, 12 to a carton, because they represented the apostles. And we have that today. When you go home and open up your refrigerator, you need to salute the 12 apostles on whichever shelf they are. So, now we're getting to the Bible. What did Alfred have to do with the Bible? Remarkably, Alfred translated into British 8 works himself. Very brilliant man. Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Boethicius' Consolation of Philosophy, St. Augustine's Soliloquies, the first 50 Psalms of the Psalter, excerpts from the book of Exodus, Orosius' Histories Against the Pagans, Bede's Ecclesiastic History of the English People, and the Old English Martyrology. He took all of those that were mostly in Latin, and some had some Greek phrases in them, and translated all of that into Old English for his people. And this is a copy of the facing page of Gregory's Pastoral Care, translated into English by Alfred the Great. And he said, in the foreword to this, talking about this, he said, "In some of my translation I have done so word for word, and in other words for meaning, in order that the meaning prevail, that the bishops may teach effectively." So you see, we have these little gems of information that we still have in the British Library and in the British Museum today. But since we're so far from that time and far from that area, we as Americans don't know the history typically. Alfred established a court school to educate his own children, the sons of his nobles, and intellectually promising boys of lesser birth, an attempt to require literacy in those who held offices of authority. He wanted everyone who held an office of authority throughout the realm to know how to read, and he used the scriptures and he used ancient texts translated into English so that they could understand it and know how to lead. He personally worked on a series of translations into the vernacular of Latin works he deemed most necessary for all men to know, and a compilation of a chronicle detailing the rise of his house's kingdom with a genealogy that stretched back to Adam, thus giving the West Saxon kings a biblical ancestry. And so he took it right back through the Celts that came up and through Joseph of Arimathea and all of that history. He said, hey, I know this history. It was 750 years ago, but we're going to write it down. And he did. He actually had these made up. Now, what are these? They're called Alfred's Pointer. He made a bunch of these. We don't know exactly how many. And he sent one to every bishop in his kingdom with a copy of Gregory's Pastoral Care. And you'll hear me later talk bad about Gregory because I don't agree with his Catholic philosophy and his control of the church. But Gregory, in the beginning of his reign as Pope, did do a pretty good job staying close to the Bible for his pastoral care, how pastors should take care of their flocks, and then gave Bible references to taking care of the flock as opposed to abusing them. But there's still several of these. This is a picture of one that really still exists today in the British Museum. And what you did was, this is a little holder right here, if you can see. And when you lift this part up, it's got a picture of a scribe with the power of the king that is in the middle here. And it's in beautiful jewels and this surrounding, and you pick it up, and that way you could look at the large Bibles that they had in those days, and the bishop would actually point to the words he was telling people. And so Alfred said, I'm sending you a pointer, and I want you to open up this book, and I want you to point to exactly what it says that is equal to the Bible to teach your people. Also, about a fifth of the early English law code is taken up by Alfred's introduction, which includes translations into English. Remember, back in those days, nobody could read English because nothing written down was translated into English until he came along. The Ten Commandments, a few chapters from the book of Exodus, and the apostolic letter from the Acts of the Apostles. The introduction may be best understood as Alfred's meditation upon the meaning of Christian law. It traces the continuity between God's gift of law to Moses to Alfred's own issuances of law to the West Saxon people. By doing so, it linked the holy past to the historical present and represented Alfred's law-giving as a type of divine legislation. And so what all that means is he used specific things from the Old Testament and the New Testament to say, this is what English law is going to look like. And in the legal code, we actually have copies of the English code. Now this one is from 1890, but it shows that the basis of English common law was Alfred the Great. And that's how we have so much, even in our own law today, that is from the Bible. Because those moral principles and those laws of the people of God found their way into English common law. In Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, it was the most popular philosophical handbook of the Middle Ages. And Alfred is quoted in here several times. he quotes the English version, which is this a copy of the Old English, and he says, "To speak briefly, I desire to live worthily as long as I live, and after my life to leave to them that should come after my memory and good works." Now that kind of gives you a humanity to him. He also said, in Blossman's anthology, the first half is an English translation of Augustine's soliloquies from 400 AD. And this material has traditionally been thought to contain much that is Alfred's own and highly characteristic of him. The ending contains the epitaph for this noblest of English kings. He says this, pay attention to this. "Therefore, he seems to me a very foolish man and truly wretched, who will not increase his understanding while he is in the world, and ever wish and long to reach that endless life where all shall be made clear." So this was not only king, he was not only an educated king, he was not only a warrior king, but he was a Christian king that truly wished upon his people, upon the men who held the power to influence families, to be mindful of the eternal world. And so as we wrap up, we see that King Alfred the Great is pictured in stained glass to this very day in the west window of the south transept of Bristol Cathedral. And you can see here it says Alfredus Rex, and here it says Legis Angular, which means the English law that he was so famous for, which had Christian precepts in it. And finally, what about Alfred's legacy? Did any of this last past his reign? Well, yes. Elfric of Eynsham was another one of those very knowledgeable theologians back in those days. And the Old English Hexateuch is the collaborative project that translated the first 6 books of the Bible into Old English, presumably under the editorship of Alfric of Eynsham. It is the first English vernacular translation of the first 6 books of the Old Testament. It was made for use by lay people by order of the king. The translation is known in 7 manuscripts, most of which are fragmentary. The best known of these is a richly illuminated manuscript in the British Library. So I'm telling you all of this to get into our minds that we have a rich history. The British were theologians of renown and missionaries that actually went to the continent to affect all of Charlemagne's lands and all of the European Empire, and these few men who went changed the course of European and history and world history because of that. And these are leaves from that work. So next, we are going to study John Wycliffe, and some people may call it Wycliffe, but technically they say you're supposed to call it Wycliffe. John Wycliffe in 1360 AD. We're going to jump ahead a few hundred years, but not really. I'm going to do a little historic background in between there. The Morning Star of the Reformation began to translate all the scriptures from Latin into English, which was forbidden by law that was instituted by the Roman Catholic kings Henry III and Henry VIII. So that's what we'll do next, coming up. So as we end the presentation and go into discussion, let me pray.